A single dad, struggling to bake cupcakes for his daughter's birthday, finds unexpected help and maybe something more when the reclusive millionaire next door knocks on his door with a mixing bowl and a secret. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The kitchen clock blinked 11:47 p.m. in soft red numbers. Jack Bennet squinted at the flour-dusted recipe card, scratched his head, and peered into the oven with all the hope of a man on the edge. The faint smell of burnt sugar hit him just before the smoke curled past the oven door. Again, he yanked the tray out with a potholder that had seen better days, wincing as the blackened cupcake tops sagged like deflated balloons. "Great," he muttered, tossing the pan on the counter. Perfect. This was his third attempt, and each one had gone a little worse than the last. The first batch had no sugar. The second had double baking soda. And now, this, the scorch special. From the next room came the gentle creak of old floorboards, followed by the soft thump of Sophie turning in her sleep. Her birthday was hours away, and all Jack wanted was for her to wake up to something special, something sweet, something that said, "I didn't forget." He leaned against the counter, rubbing his eyes. The grocery store cupcakes were still an option if he could spare the gas and if he could bear the look on Sophie's face when she saw the plastic dome and generic sprinkles. Jack sighed and reached for the mixing bowl again. Maybe one more try. Just one more. The bag of flour slipped as he grabbed it, puffing a small white cloud into the air. It settled in his hair, on his shirt, across the counter, like dust on old memories. He looked around the kitchen, small and worn but filled with love crayon drawings taped to the fridge, a chipped mug that read, "One Dad," and the tiny pink apron Sophie insisted he wear whenever they baked together. He stood there, silent, unsure if he was stubborn or just tired. Outside, the night was still and cold. Somewhere, in the dark, a porch light flicked on. Jack didn't notice it at first. Not until the quiet knock came at the door, gentle, uncertain. He paused, frowning. No one knocked this late. Not here. When he opened the door, the last thing he expected to see was the woman from the house next door, wrapped in a long sweater and holding a silver mixing bowl in her hands. The mansion next door had always been a question mark big and beautiful, yet strangely silent. It sat behind a weathered iron gate and an overgrown hedge of rose bushes that hadn't bloomed in years. Most days, it felt like a backdrop more than a place someone actually lived in. People in town said different things. Some claimed it was empty. Others whispered about old money and a woman who'd come back after losing everything. Jack never paid much attention. He was too busy working double shifts and raising Sophie to worry about neighborly mysteries. But tonight, the house wasn't dark. A single light glowed from a second-story window, soft and golden against the inky night. Jack had noticed it earlier while waiting for the second batch of cupcakes to cool. He'd glanced out the window absently, only to freeze when he saw movement, just the shadow of a figure behind gauzy curtains. A woman, maybe, though he couldn't be sure. Now, as he stood by the sink rinsing out a scorched pan, he glanced up again. The light was still on. The silhouette had returned closer this time. Still, watching. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure why it unsettled him. Maybe because no one had ever watched him before. Not like that. In the window the curtains fluttered slightly, like they were being held. Then they closed. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Probably just a neighbor being neighborly. Or curious. He was making a mess of things, after all burning cupcakes and talking to himself like a lunatic. Maybe she just found the whole thing entertaining. Back at the counter, he picked up the crumpled recipe card again, determined to try one last time. He cracked 2 eggs into a bowl and reached for the milk, hoping the fridge hadn't turned it. He didn't see the porch light next door flick on. Didn't hear the quiet click of a front door opening. But the woman in the mansion had made a decision. She wasn't going to watch from the window anymore. The knock was so gentle, Jack almost missed it just a soft tap-tap that barely rose above the hum of the old refrigerator. He froze, whisk mid-stir, brow furrowed. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. No one knocked this late. Not in this neighborhood. Not unless something was wrong. Then it came again. 3 taps, slightly firmer this time. Jack wiped his hands on a dish towel and moved cautiously toward the door, glancing once at the clock. 8 a.m. He cracked the door open, careful, prepared to tell off a kid pulling a prank or a neighbor needing jumper cables. Instead, he found her. The woman from the mansion stood on his porch, wrapped in a thick oatmeal-colored sweater and soft wool gloves. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, and in her right hand she held a stainless steel whisk like it was a peace offering. In the pale glow of the porch light, her expression was hesitant but kind. "Hi," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Sorry to bother you. I noticed you were baking." Jack blinked. Yeah. Trying to, anyway." She looked down at the whisk in her hand, then back up. "I used to bake. Professionally. A long time ago. I saw you tossing out another batch and thought you might want some help?" Jack stood in the doorway, stunned. Of all the scenarios he'd imagined behind that glowing window, this wasn't one of them. She didn't look like someone who'd ever touched a bag of flour. More like someone who stepped out of a magazine ad for silk robes and luxury tea. "I'm Elise," she added, lifting the whisk slightly, like a greeting. "Jack," he replied after a beat. "Jack Bennett." They stood there in silence for a moment, 2 strangers framed by the doorway, the night air cool between them. Elise smiled, small and unsure. "I promise I'm not crazy, just figured cupcakes are better with company." Jack stepped aside without quite realizing he was doing it. "Come in," he said. "The kitchen's a disaster, but you're welcome to it." And just like that, the mansion next door didn't seem quite so far away. Jack watched as Elise stepped inside, her eyes scanning the modest kitchen like it was some kind of sacred space. She didn't make a face at the flour-dusted counters or the dented pans drying beside the sink. Instead, she smiled softly, slipping off her gloves and placing the whisk on the counter like she'd done this 100 times. He wasn't sure what to say. The house felt smaller somehow, filled with the quiet presence of someone unexpected. Sophie's birthday banner half-hung, half-falling swayed slightly with the draft from the door. A bowl of ruined batter sat like a failed science project between them. "So," Elise said gently. "Vanilla or chocolate?" Jack blinked. She asked for vanilla, with sprinkles." Elise nodded. "Classic." She opened a cupboard without asking, as if the space already felt familiar. Her movements were precise, practiced. She measured flour by feel. She cracked eggs without shells. Jack, still uncertain, moved to the side and let her take the lead. He handed her what she asked for: a spoon, the sugar, a chipped measuring cup that had survived more birthdays than he cared to count. They didn't speak much. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was companionable. The kind that fills the air when 2 people are focused on something simple and good. At one point, Elise reached for the mixing bowl, just as Jack did. Their hands brushed, lightly dusted with flour. They both paused. She smiled without pulling away. "Sorry," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Don't be," she murmured. The batter came together quickly under her careful hands. Jack leaned on the counter, watching her work. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. Just stirred, poured, moved like someone who hadn't felt useful in a long time and was quietly glad for the chance. When the cupcakes were finally in the oven, Jack found himself standing beside her, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the soft tick of the timer. "Thank you," he said. Elise looked over, eyes warm. It's nice to bake for someone again. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like maybe he wasn't doing this alone. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen window in soft golden streaks, casting light across the tiled floor and catching on the swirl of pastel frosting that crowned each freshly baked cupcake. They sat proudly on a mismatched tray in the center of the table. 12. Perfect little victories. scattered with rainbow sprinkles and a dusting of edible glitter Elise had found tucked away in Jack's forgotten spice rack. Sophie patted in slowly, her hair a wild tangle of sleepy curls, still rubbing her eyes with one hand and clutching her worn stuffed rabbit with the other. Her socks slid slightly on the floor as she stopped in the doorway, blinking at the unfamiliar sight of Simonena, her dad, sitting at the kitchen table. Elise smiled gently. Sipping from a floral mug Jack had hastily dug out of a back cabinet. She looked oddly at ease in the space, her sweater sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back into a loose, low bun. The room smelled like sugar and vanilla and something else. Sophie couldn't quite place warmth, maybe. Jack was by the stove, flipping pancakes with a care that meant he was trying too hard. He looked over and gave a sheepish grin. "Morning, birthday girl." Sophie's gaze bounced between her dad and the stranger, with a cupcake tray between them. "Who's that?" she asked bluntly, voice still raspy with sleep. Elise set down her mug. "I'm Elise. I live next door." Sophie's brows lifted with sudden interest. "The house with the spooky bushes?" Jack coughed to hide a laugh. "Soft manners." "It's okay," Elise said, clearly amused. "Yes, the house with the spooky bushes." Sophie walked slowly into the kitchen, eyes locked on the cupcakes like they were treasure. "Did you make those?" "Your dad and I made them together." Sophie's eyes went wide. "He let you bake?" Elise grinned. "He did. Well, they look way better than last year's." "Sophie?" Jack warned, trying not to smile. "What?" Sophie shrugged. "They do." Then, turning to Elise, she climbed onto a chair beside her and said, "Okay, so, what's your story?" And just like that, Elise became part of the table. The cupcakes didn't last long. 2 bites in, Sophie declared them basically perfect, and insisted on eating a second before pancakes. Jack surrendered with a mock sigh, pouring coffee for himself and topping off Elise's mug as they all sat at the table like it was the most normal thing in the world. But it wasn't normal. Not for Jack. And definitely not for Elise. Sophie, full of sugar and curiosity, fired off question after question: where Elise was from, whether she had any pets, if she'd ever been to Disneyland. Elise answered each one patiently, laughing softly, her fingers wrapped around her coffee mug like it was a lifeline. Jack mostly listened, watched. He noticed how Elise's smile didn't always reach her eyes, how she glanced at the front door every so often, like she wasn't sure how long she'd be allowed to stay. Eventually, Sophie scampered off to her room to find her birthday crown, and the kitchen quieted. Elise stared down into her coffee for a beat, then said softly, "I used to own a bakery." Jack glanced up from the sink. "Yeah?" "In Charleston. It was called Maison Elise. Fancy name, fancy shop." Her voice held a flicker of pride, and something else, just beneath it, regret. "That's where you learned to bake like that?" Jack asked, nodding toward the empty tray of cupcakes. "I learned to bake long before that," she said, her eyes distant. "From my grandmother, in a tiny kitchen with cracked tiles and the smell of cinnamon in every drawer." Jack dried his hands on a towel. "So what happened?" Elise didn't answer right away. She traced a finger along the rim of her mug. "Life happened. Business got too big, too fast. Investors wanted quantity over quality. I tried to fight it." She paused. "I lost." Jack leaned on the counter, arms crossed. "So you walked away?" She looked up at him then, and for the first time, the polished calm slipped. "I broke down," she admitted. "And then I disappeared." For a moment, Jack didn't know what to say. He saw it then, the cracks behind her composure, the weight she carried quietly. "Well," he said finally, nodding toward the cupcakes, "for what it's worth, you still got it." And that made her smile just a little. But this time, it felt real. By noon, the backyard had been transformed at least as much as Jack could manage on a tight budget and a handful of mismatched decorations. Paper streamers fluttered from the porch railing. A folding table held dollar store plates and juice boxes. And a bright pink, "Happy Birthday, Sophie!" banner hung slightly crooked across the fence. Sophie wore her glittery birthday crown like royalty, spinning in circles on the grass, while her classmates screamed and laughed through a makeshift game of freeze tag. Jack manned the grill 2 hot dogs at a time, trying not to burn anything or forget who had mustard allergies. The cupcakes, now legendary thanks to Elise's touch, sat neatly on a tray covered in foil, ready to make their second debut. From the upstairs window of the house next door, Elise watched quietly. She hadn't planned to, but the sound of laughter and the shimmer of balloons had drawn her to the window like a magnet. She stood there, arms crossed, sipping tea that had long since gone cold. There was something about birthdays that always hit her sideways. Maybe it was the years she'd spent making perfect cakes for strangers' kids, then going home to silence. Or maybe it was the memory of the one birthday she'd hoped to celebrate with someone who never made it that far. Either way, she told herself she'd just watch for a minute. Just enough to see Sophie blow out the candles. But then Sophie looked up, right up at the window, and waved. Elise startled, almost stepping back from the glass. But Sophie just beamed, then cupped her hands around her mouth. "Come over!" she shouted. Elise blinked. "I saved you a cupcake," Sophie added. From below, Jack looked up, shading his eyes with one hand. He met Elise's gaze with something that wasn't quite surprise, but definitely wasn't expectation either. "Just hope." Elise hesitated, her fingers tightening on the windowsill. She hadn't planned on leaving the house today, but somehow, a little girl's invitation felt heavier than her past. So she set her tea down, smoothed her sweater, and made her way to the back door. The backyard buzzed with the happy chaos. Only a group of 8-year-olds could create squeals of delight, the rhythmic thud of jump rope, the occasional wail over spilled juice or a popped balloon. Jack moved through it all like a gentle current, steadying plates, tying loose shoelaces, and refilling lemonade with practiced ease. Elise stood near the edge of the party. Beneath the dappled shade of the oak tree, a polite smile etched carefully onto her face. Sophie had insisted she wear a party hat, and so she did, light pink, with a glittery star on top, slightly askew like it didn't quite belong. She clapped when Sophie opened gifts, helped cut the cupcakes, and complimented the store-bought piñata like it was handmade. But Jack saw it the way she tensed when the noise peaked, when laughter turned to shrieking, the way her eyes flitted to the edges of the yard like she was trying to memorize the exits. She was present, but only just. Jack handed her a soda and stood beside her in companionable silence for a moment. The sun had warmed the air, but Elise still held her arms tight against her body like she was cold inside. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Just not used to this much energy all at once." He chuckled. "They come with batteries that never die." She smiled at that, but her gaze followed a small group of kids chasing bubbles across the lawn. One boy tripped and fell, shrieked with laughter as the others dogpiled him. Elise's fingers curled slightly, as though she expected someone to get hurt. Jack noticed. "You've been great with Sophie," he offered. "You didn't have to come today." "I wanted to," she said, her voice soft. "She's easy to love." The words hung in the air a moment too long. Jack glanced at her, watching the way her smile lingered while her eyes stayed somewhere else. Behind all her quiet charm and calm poise, there were walls glass, maybe, but thick. He couldn't see through them. Not yet. But today was a crack. Small. Fragile. But a start. It started the Tuesday after the party. Sophie, still glowing from her birthday weekend, stood at the kitchen sink with her bowl of cereal and looked out the window like she always did. But this time, instead of watching the birds or waiting for her dad to call out that the car was warmed up, she looked at the big house next door. She stared for a beat, then lifted her little hand and waved. Just once. Just in case. No one waved back. The next Tuesday she did it again. Cereal in one hand, she waved with the other, this time a little longer, a little more hopeful. Again, no answer. But Sophie was persistent. Jack had once joked that if she ever decided to run the world, it wouldn't take long. So every Tuesday morning, without fail, she stood at the window and waved. And then, on the third Tuesday, Elise waved back. It was brief, almost shy, but it happened. Sophie gasped like she'd just seen a shooting star. Jack, standing behind her pouring coffee, leaned over her shoulder and caught the tail end of it. He arched a brow, but said nothing. That afternoon, Sophie came home from school and made a beeline to the kitchen window. And there, taped to the glass of the house next door, was a note scribbled in delicate handwriting. "Want to help me bake next week?" Sophie let out a delighted squeal that echoed through the whole house. By the following Tuesday, it was a ritual. After school, Jack would walk Sophie to the edge of the yard, and Elise would meet them halfway with a soft smile and a clean apron hanging from her arm. Jack would stay just long enough to be polite, then return home to the quiet hum of the empty kitchen while laughter drifted in from next door. Sometimes, he'd glance out and see them through the window, Sophie standing on a stool, Elise kneeling beside her, both of them covered in flour, faces lit by smiles. And every time, Jack felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't dared feel in a long time: hope. The kitchen in the Hawthorne house had once been the quietest room in Elise's world. Marble counters, untouched appliances, and silence that echoed like regret. But on Tuesdays, that silence was gone. Now it was full of laughter, and clanging spoons, and spilled flour that trailed across the tile like little footprints. And in the middle of it all was Sophie standing on a wooden stool, wearing a tea towel tied around her waist like an apron, her sleeves rolled up, and her face streaked with a dab of vanilla frosting. "Too much salt ruins everything," Elise said, gently guiding Sophie's hand as she measured the dry ingredients. Sophie giggled. "My dad did that once with pancakes. It was so gross." Elise smiled. Not just at the story, but at how quickly this little girl had carved a space in her home and her heart. Sophie didn't ask hard questions. She didn't seem to care that the house was too big, or that Elise sometimes drifted off when the memories came too close. She just showed up, every Tuesday, ready to bake and talk and laugh. They made cinnamon rolls that day. Sophie shaped the dough with careful fingers while Elise mixed the icing. They played music quietly in the background, an old jazz playlist Elise hadn't touched in years. It felt like breathing again. When Jack came to pick her up, he stepped onto the porch and found Sophie waiting at the front door, clutching a lopsided Tupperware container filled with warm, sticky rolls. Her cheeks were pink from the heat, and her eyes were glowing. "She's really good at rolling the dough," Elise said, stepping out behind her, wiping her hands on a tea towel that matched Sophie's. Jack looked between them, this unlikely pair, and something shifted in his chest. "She's good at a lot of things," he said quietly. Elise met his eyes for a moment, then glanced down, her voice softer. "She's easy to love." He didn't say anything right away, but the words landed. Honest and gentle, like everything about Elise he didn't quite understand yet. As they walked back home, Sophie bounced beside him, cinnamon rolls in hand, already chattering about what they'd bake next week. Jack looked back once, and Elise was still standing there, tea towel in hand, watching them go. Maplewood wasn't the kind of town where secrets stayed secret for long. The moment something new stirred, the breeze carried it straight to the front porches and corner diners, tucked neatly between sips of coffee and the clink of forks against pie plates. So when people started seeing Sophie skipping down the sidewalk with a Tupperware full of pastries too pretty, too perfect to have come from Jack's kitchen, folks took notice. By the end of that week, the whispers had begun. "I saw her coming out of that house," murmured Mrs. Cartwright at the bakery. "You know, the big one with the overgrown roses? Elise Hawthorne lives there, doesn't she? The one with all that money from, what was it, cake shops? Or a restaurant?" asked someone else, lowering their voice. "Thought she left town years ago. Or was hiding from a scandal. Remember that article in the Herald about her company going under? And now she's baking with Jack Bennett's little girl? It wasn't malicious at first, just curious. Small-town curious, which could be worse than mean. questions disguised as politeness, smiles stretched too wide when Jack dropped Sophie off at school, extra long stares at the gas station. A woman at the hardware store even asked if Elise was babysitting Sophie, like she couldn't imagine any other reason they'd be together. Jack tried to ignore it. He was used to being the subject of town chatter first when his wife died, then when he took over the garage, and always for raising Sophie on his own. But now the attention had a new flavor, one that hovered between judgment and fascination. It didn't help that Elise rarely left her house unless it was Tuesday. And when she did, she kept her head down, moved quietly, avoided the very eyes that were now turning her way again after so long. One afternoon, Jack overheard two customers at the garage whispering near the waiting area, something about lonely millionaires and single dads with charm. He walked back into the bay without saying a word, jaw tight, grease on his hands, Sophie's drawing of a cupcake taped to the inside of his toolbox. He didn't care what people said, but he couldn't help wondering if Elise did. The smell of cinnamon filled Elise's kitchen, warm and sweet, the kind of scent that wrapped around your ribs and made the world feel a little softer. The dough was rising on the counter, Sophie's favorite playlist still lingering faintly from her last visit. Elise moved through the motions preheating the oven, greasing the pans, rolling out dough, her hands steady, but her mind somewhere else. Lately, she'd felt it creeping in again, that quiet, clawing weight she thought she'd left behind. The whispers in town hadn't escaped her. She saw the way people glanced sideways at the grocery store, felt the shift in air when she walked into a room. It was familiar, too familiar. She reached for the baking sheet, distracted, and brushed the side of her hand against the open oven rack. The pain hit instantly sharp, searing. She dropped the tray with a loud clang, stumbling back as the sound bounced off the tile and metal and glass. Her breath caught in her throat. The burn throbbed, but worse than the pain was what followed. The rush of panic came fast and hard. Her knees hit the floor before she realized she was falling. The room tilted sideways. The scent of cinnamon turned sour in her nose. Her breath shortened into quick, shallow bursts as her vision tunneled. Her hands screamed with pain, but her chest felt like it was caving in. She curled forward on the cool tile, trying to ground herself, but the memories came anyway. The last time she burned herself in a kitchen, the last time she let it all fall apart. She didn't know how long she sat there, trembling, until she heard a voice. Elise? Jack's voice. She didn't remember calling him. Maybe she had. Maybe instinct had reached for him when her own strength gave out. Suddenly, he was beside her, crouching low, his hands careful as he touched her back. Hey, I've got you, he said softly. You're okay. Just breathe. She tried. Her breath hitched. Her voice broke. And then she said it barely a whisper. I can't do this alone anymore. Jack didn't let go, and for the first time, Elise let herself fall apart, right there on the kitchen floor, in the only arms that had ever felt safe. The house was quiet after the panic faded. Jack had wrapped Elise's hand in a cool, damp towel, then helped her to the couch without asking too many questions. He didn't press. He didn't fill the silence with soft lies or empty reassurances. He just sat beside her, letting the stillness settle like dust around them. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the wide hallway that stretched behind them. Elise stared into it, her voice quiet and uncertain when she finally spoke. His name was Ryan, she said, her eyes not leaving the floor. We were engaged. He used to laugh at how fast I could ice a cake and said he'd marry me for my croissants alone. Jack didn't move, didn't interrupt. He died 3 years ago. Motorcycle accident. He was late to meet me for a tasting at the bakery, and he never showed. Just a call from the hospital. Just like that. She snapped her fingers softly. Gone. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression unreadable but open. I kept the business going for a while after that. Threw myself into it, actually. Worked 12-hour days, convinced I could bake my way through the grief. Her voice wavered. But the investors started pushing me to expand. Mass production, storefronts in other cities. It stopped being about butter and sugar and people and turned into charts and margins and frozen batter in warehouses. I hated it. Hated what it made me. She paused, her gaze drifting to the burn on her hand. So I let it fall apart. Quietly. I closed the original shop, disappeared from interviews, pulled my name from everything. Moved here. To the last house Ryan and I ever talked about buying. It was supposed to be ours. Jack's voice came low. Why this house? Elise looked at him then, something deep and raw behind her tired eyes. We picked it because of the big kitchen and the extra bedroom. We thought we'd fill it with kids, laughter, maybe a dog. She swallowed hard, but the house stayed empty. No Ryan, no bakery, no children, just ghosts in the hallway. Jack reached out, his hand warm over hers, careful not to touch the bandage. It's not empty anymore, he said gently. And for the first time in years, Elise allowed herself to believe that might be true. Sunday mornings used to be quiet. For Jack, they were slow, start-scoffy, half gone, before Sophie rolled out of bed, a mental to-do list ticking louder than the silence in the house. For Elise, they were lonelier still. Tea in an untouched kitchen, windows closed, curtains drawn. But that changed the first time Sophie knocked on Elise's front door with a whisk in one hand and a hopeful grin on her face. Now, Sundays smelled like vanilla and lemon zest, like cinnamon and melted butter. Like family. The trio fell into an easy rhythm. Jack bringing ingredients and doing the heavy lifting, literally, when Elise needed the big mixing bowl from the top shelf. Sophie commanding the sprinkle operations, and Elise guiding the whole thing with the kind of grace that made the process feel less like baking and more like magic. They took turns choosing recipes. Sophie liked bright, fun things: unicorn cupcakes, rainbow confetti cookies, anything that required edible glitter and a lot of pink. Jack leaned traditional, leaning toward banana bread and oatmeal raisin with a practical, it'll go well in lunches kind of logic. Elise, in between them, introduced flavors they'd never tried: lavender shortbread, rosemary honey scones, dark chocolate tarts dusted with sea salt. The kitchen buzzed with laughter and messy hands. Sophie's apron was always askew. Jack always had flour in his hair, and Elise, she smiled more. She didn't notice it at first, how easy it had become, how the empty chair at her table now stayed filled, how the house no longer echoed, how the silence she'd once clung to had quietly been replaced with Sophie's stories about school, Jack's dry jokes, and the soft hum of happiness. One Sunday, after the last batch had gone into the oven and the smell of almond cake filled the room, Jack poured coffee and slid a mug across the counter. Elise took it, fingers brushing his, and smiled without hesitation. No masks, no guarded pauses. I don't remember the last time I looked forward to something, she said softly, more to herself than anyone. Jack looked at her, then at Sophie dancing in flower footprints across the floor. Me neither, he said. And Elise believed him. The kitchen was a beautiful mess. Crumbs dusted the counter like confetti. Frosting streaked the edge of the sink, and a warm batch of lemon poppy seed cupcakes cooled on a wire rack, while Sophie hummed to herself, decorating the ugly ones with wild abandon. Jack leaned back against the fridge, arms crossed, watching Elise with an amused glint in his eye. She was piping frosting onto a tray of perfect swirls, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sophie, meanwhile, was confidently pressing gummy bears into hers and calling them extra fancy. You know, Jack said casually, if this whole garage thing ever falls apart, I could probably sell your cupcakes out of the back of my truck. We'd make a killing at construction sites. Elise snorted, not looking up. What? Like a cupcake food truck for grease monkeys? Exactly. I'll be the muscle, you be the genius. Sophie runs PR. Hey, Sophie called from the other side of the counter, her face smeared with chocolate. I am good at telling people what's delicious. Jack laughed, shaking his head. We'd need a name, something catchy. Elise paused, turning toward him with a curious smile. What about the cupcake window? Jack raised a brow. Sounds like a fairy tale. Well, Elise said, shrugging, this feels a bit like one. There was a beat of silence, warm, and a little heavier than before. Jack met her eyes, expecting her to laugh the idea off, to wave it away like one of his bad dad jokes. But instead, Elise wiped her hands on a tea towel, walked over to the table, and sat. I'm serious, she said quietly. What if we did sell them? Jack blinked. You mean, like, actually start something? She nodded. Not a truck, probably, but maybe a small online thing, or pop-ups at the farmer's market. People would buy these, Jack. I know they would. He watched her carefully. And who's funding this magical cupcake empire? Elise's smile deepened. Me. Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again. I've got the time, the experience, and more money than I know what to do with, she added gently. He looked at her, a little stunned. You'd really do that? For you and Sophie? She said. Yes, I'd like to build something that actually means something. And for the first time, Jack tasted the possibility, sweet and rich and real. The kitchen table had become a war room scattered with sticky notes, crayon sketches, a half-empty bag of marshmallows, and Sophie's glitter pens, which she insisted were required for creative decisions. Jack sat with a pencil behind his ear, flipping through Elise's neatly organized recipe binder, while Elise herself typed ideas into a spreadsheet with all the quiet focus of someone trying not to get too excited too fast. They were building something. Together. And every part of it felt unreal in the best possible way. We need a name, Jack said, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. Something simple, not too frilly. Something sweet, Sophie chimed in, balancing on her knees, elbows on the table. And magical, and windowy. Jack raised an eyebrow. Windowy? Sophie nodded solemnly. Because we always see each other through the kitchen windows. And that's where the magic started, right? Elise froze mid-keystroke. Sophie picked up a crayon, scrawled 3 words on a fresh piece of paper, and held it up like a grand unveiling. The cupcake window. It read in purple glitter ink, with a little heart for the dot on the eye. Jack tilted his head, actually impressed. Not bad, kiddo. But Elise just stared. She didn't smile at first, didn't speak. Her lips parted, and for a moment she looked like someone who'd just been handed something far more precious than a business name. Hey, Jack said softly. You okay? She nodded quickly, blinking fast. It's just, that's what Ryan used to call the front display at our shop. It was a big bay window where we'd showcase our best cupcakes. He always said it was the heart of the place, that if people stopped at the window, they'd come in for the warmth. Jack's face softened. Sophie didn't know that. I know, Elise whispered. That's what makes it perfect. Sophie, sensing something meaningful had happened, but not quite grasping it, smiled anyway. So, is it a yes? Elise reached across the table, took Sophie's hand in hers, and gave it a gentle squeeze. It's the best name I've ever heard. It was a Thursday afternoon when the past came knocking. Jack was elbow-deep in engine grease at the garage, humming under his breath, when his phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession. Sophie was home with Elise, helping test a new blueberry lemon muffin recipe. Everything had felt steady, lately warm, full of light. So when he glanced at the screen and saw Kimberly Bennett, his late wife's sister, his stomach twisted. By the time he made it home, Kimberly was already parked in the driveway, sharp pantsuit, hair too perfectly pinned for Maplewood, her expression tight with disapproval. She was standing on the porch, arms crossed, tapping her fingers against her phone. Elise had the door open, visibly uneasy but composed, Sophie peeking out from behind her apron in the kitchen. Kimberly, Jack said, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped out of the truck. Didn't expect to see you. Kimberly didn't waste time. I was in the area. Thought I'd stop by to see how Sophie's doing. Imagine my surprise when I show up and find her playing house with a stranger. Jack stiffened. Elise is a neighbor. And a friend. A neighbor who happens to be here during school pickups, birthday parties, and what's this? A baking business? Kimberly's voice was sharp. Jack, this isn't stable. It's concerning. Sophie's smile faltered, shrinking back a little. Jack stepped forward, voice low but firm. She's not a stranger to us. She's been kind. She's helped. And more than that, she's good for Sophie. Kimberly's eyes flicked toward Elise, who remained still, quiet. Watching. I know you're doing your best, Jack. But maybe it's time we think about what's best for Sophie long term. My offer still stands. If you ever feel overwhelmed. He cut her off. No, Jack. I said no, he repeated, more steel behind the words this time. She's my daughter. I'm not perfect, but she's loved, safe, and she's happy. Kimberly's eyes narrowed. We'll see if that holds up if it ever gets official. She turned without another word and climbed into her car, tires crunching on the gravel as she drove off. Jack stood frozen for a moment. Then he turned to Elise, who had taken Sophie's hand without even thinking. You okay? He asked her quietly. Elise nodded, her expression unreadable. But deep down, something old and cold had stirred, reminding her that happiness could be fragile, and nothing good was ever guaranteed. The next Tuesday, the kitchen window stayed dark. No note taped to the glass, no flour-dusted apron waiting at the door, no soft knock, no familiar smile. Just silence. Sophie stood by the sink, clutching the whisk she'd insisted on bringing home last week, so I can be ready right when Miss Elise is. Her face drawn in quiet confusion. She probably just forgot, she said more to herself than to Jack. Or maybe her oven's broken. Jack crouched beside her, brushing a hand gently through her hair. Maybe, he said, but he knew better. Since Kimberly's surprise visit, something had shifted in Elise. She hadn't answered his calls. Not curtly just, not at all. A polite text reply once, hours later. Busy this week. Hope Sophie's well. It had read, like a business memo. Clean. Detached. Not Elise. The worst part? Jack understood. Kimberly's words had landed like darts. Some of them pointed directly at Elise. Stranger. Instability. Not family. It didn't matter that Elise had done nothing wrong. She'd always carried guilt like a second skin, and now it had flared up again, closing her off in the same way it had after Ryan. Self-preservation disguised as retreat. But try explaining that to an 8-year-old. By Thursday, Sophie had stopped checking the window. She doesn't like me anymore, does she? She asked quietly over dinner, pushing peas around her plate. Jack's heart cracked. Sweetheart, no, that's not it. Then why'd she disappear? He reached across the table, taking her small hand in his. Sometimes grown-ups get scared, even the strong ones, and sometimes they push people away when they care too much. Sophie's eyes shimmered, but she nodded like she understood even though she didn't. Not really. That night, after she fell asleep, Jack stood at the back door and stared across the yard. The mansion loomed still and dark, the kitchen light coldly absent. He missed the chaos of flower fights, the smell of scones in the oven, the sound of two laughs overlapping in the space that used to echo too loudly. He didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if he even could. All he knew was that the window between them had closed. And this time, Elise was the one who'd pulled the curtain. The kitchen felt hollow without her. Jack stood at the counter with a bowl of thick, lumpy batter and flour dusted up to his elbows. He squinted at the page in Elise's elegant handwriting, the lemon almond muffin recipe she'd once called light as air and twice as lovely. But no matter how closely he followed the steps, something wasn't right. The batter felt too heavy, the oven uneven, the silence unnatural. Sophie sat on a stool, chin in her hands, watching him with a worried kind of hope, the kind that came from a kid who desperately wanted things to go back to normal but didn't know how to make them. Are you sure she added baking soda and powder? Jack muttered, sniffing the batter suspiciously. She said just a pinch, Sophie offered, voice soft. Jack gave her a half smile. That's the problem. Her pinch is like magic. He poured the batter into the muffin tins anyway, determined. They sat awkwardly in the pan, uneven and slightly sunken already. Jack slid them into the oven and set the timer, forcing himself to stay hopeful. 20 minutes later, the hope collapsed, just like the muffins. They came out flat and pale, with burnt edges and soggy centers. Jack cursed under his breath and tossed his oven mitt onto the counter in frustration. Sophie stared at them. "They don't look like hers." "I know. They don't smell like hers either." "I know, kiddo." She tried to pick one up, but it crumbled in her fingers. "I wanted to bring one to Mrs. Green tomorrow." Her voice broke at the end of the sentence, the weight of a week's worth of missing showing in the tremble of her chin. Jack knelt beside her as she wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt. "Hey. It's okay." "It's not," she whispered. "Miss Elise would have made them right." Jack closed his eyes for a second, chest tight. He didn't know what had hurt, worse watching Elise retreat or watching Sophie try not to miss her. "You're right," he said, finally. "We need her, not just for the muffins." Sophie looked up, blinking. "Are you going to go get her?" Jack gave a slow, steady nod. "Yeah," he said. "I think it's time." The article dropped on a Monday morning, glossy, loud, and splashed across the front page of a national lifestyle magazine. From frosting to fortune. The disappearance and reemergence of Elise Hawthorne. A full spread complete, with old photos of her bakery, stock images of cupcakes, and an unfortunate headshot she hadn't known they still had rights to. The article painted her as a tragic figure turned recluse, rumored to be resurfacing in a sleepy Midwestern town, far from the glitz of Charleston. Elise saw it on her phone when she opened an email from an old colleague. "You okay?" was all it said, followed by the link. The breath left her chest. By noon, the bakery's name was trending in foodie circles again. A few reporters tagged her name on social media. But it wasn't real until she stepped out onto her porch and saw a car idling across the street, windows tinted, engine humming too long. The passenger door opened briefly, and a camera lens appeared, pointed in her direction. She backed inside like she'd touched a hot stove. By Tuesday, 2 more cars had shown up. By Wednesday, someone knocked press badge and recorder in hand, a too-friendly smile, and a question about, "Your new cupcake venture with the charming mechanic and his daughter?" Elise closed the door before he could finish. The walls of her house, once safe and still, began to feel like a trap. She paced the hallway, stared out the back window toward Jack's house, and then up the stairs, to the guest room she'd never furnished, the one that was supposed to be a nursery. She sat on the floor beside the door, legs pulled in, the air thick around her. She'd come here to disappear. And for a little while she had. But now the past had caught up, wearing perfume and bright headlines, dragging everything she'd tried to bury back into the light. She thought about leaving again, packing what little she cared about and driving until the cameras couldn't find her, until the whispers died down, until the ache eased. But when she looked out the kitchen window and saw Sophie's drawings still taped to the glass 3 cupcakes and a smiley face under the words, "Come bake with us," her resolve cracked. She didn't want to run. She just didn't know how to stay. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the living room walls. Elise sat curled into one corner of the oversized couch, a knit blanket draped around her shoulders, knees tucked close to her chest. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke, but the air between them carried something heavier, unsaid truths, questions too long held back. Jack sat across from her, one arm slung over the back of the couch. His gaze steady, quiet. He hadn't spoken much since she let him in. He hadn't needed to. The look on her face when she opened the door told him everything. "I didn't ask for the article," Elise said finally, voice low and tight. "I didn't even know it was coming. Someone must have tipped them off." Jack nodded slowly. "They're parked outside your house, every day." "I know." She let out a bitter laugh. "I've barely stepped outside since Tuesday. I even made Sophie promise not to come by this week. I couldn't face her. Not like this." "You should have told me," he said gently. She looked away, toward the fire. "What would I have said?" Hey Jack, by the way, I used to be a minor celebrity with a multi-million-dollar company that crashed because I couldn't keep it together after my fiancée died." He didn't flinch. "Yeah, something like that." The corners of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. More like recognition. He didn't scare easily. Elise leaned her head back against the couch. "I was finally feeling like a person again. Not a headline, not a cautionary tale. Just me, here, with you, with Sophie." And then it all came rushing back. Jack studied her in the firelight. "You think this changes how we see you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and said, barely above a whisper, "I think I'm afraid to be happy." Jack moved closer, slowly, until they were sitting side by side. The heat from the fire was nothing compared to the warmth of his presence. "You're allowed to be happy, Elise," he said. "Even after everything. Especially after everything." She turned to him, eyes shining in the dim light. "What if I don't know how anymore?" Jack reached for her hand, careful and deliberate. "Then, let's figure it out together." By the following week, the firelight conversation had settled into something, real something with legs. Neither Jack nor Elise said the words starting over, but the decision bloomed naturally in the quiet space they shared, like steam rising from a warm oven. On Wednesday morning, Elise stepped onto her front porch with a broom in one hand and determination in the other. She swept away weeks of dust and dead leaves, shook out the old welcome mat, and for the first time since she moved in, left the door open. Sophie arrived after school with a stack of handwritten signs and a pouch full of glitter pens. "We need a menu," she declared. "And prices, but not mean prices. Just like cupcake prices, with feelings." Jack chuckled. "What kind of feelings are we talking about here?" "The kind that taste like hugs," Sophie replied without blinking. Elise leaned against the doorframe, smiling softly. She hadn't felt this much lightness in years, not since the Charleston storefront. Not since before everything fell apart. They spent Thursday baking in batches small, careful, intentional. Elise's lemon lavender cupcakes, Jack's cinnamon maple mini loaves. Sophie's contribution was a gooey, sprinkle-stuffed creation they named The Explosion. It collapsed in the middle, but no one cared. By Friday night, the porch had been transformed. Elise strung up twinkle lights across the railing. Jack built a makeshift display table from 2 crates and a piece of polished wood. Sophie crafted a cardboard sign that read, "The Cupcake Window, soft open, Saturdays only. Be nice or be hungry." The next morning, just as the sun peeked through the clouds, the 3 of them stood side by side, apron-clad, coffee cups in hand. A single customer arrived at 8:14 a.m. Mr. Dorsey, from down the street, drawn by the scent and the rumors. He bought a muffin and told Elise it was better than anything in those city places. By noon, word had spread. A dozen neighbors came. Then 24. They sold out by 1:00 p.m. As Jack packed up the last empty tray, Elise stood on the porch, eyes scanning the quiet street, the warm breeze rustling her hair. "We did it?" she murmured, more wonder than pride. Jack nudged her shoulder. "And it's only the beginning." The 3rd Saturday started like a dream. The morning sun was gentle, the breeze smelled like vanilla and promise, and a line had already begun to form at Elise's front gate before they'd even set out the first tray. Word had spread quickly. Maplewood's quiet little cupcake stand was the town's new Saturday ritual. Families came for the muffins, teens for the cookies, and older couples for the cinnamon loaves that Jack always served warm. Sophie manned her kindness jar, offering free mini cupcakes to anyone who said something nice to a stranger. It was chaos. Beautiful, sugar-dusted chaos. But by noon, the dream cracked. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb, idling too long. A man in a buttoned-up shirt and clipboard stepped out, adjusting his badge and eyeing the stand with cool detachment. "City Licensing Office," he said, approaching the porch. "Are you Elise Hawthorne?" She froze behind the table, cupcake in hand, the frosting tip still poised. Yes? I'm here following up on a complaint regarding unlicensed food sales in a residential zone. Jack stepped forward, wiping his hands on a towel. What kind of complaint? The man shrugged. Anonymous. But someone reported you for operating a food business without the proper permits. And if you're selling out of your home, we'll need to review safety, zoning, and health compliance before you continue. Elise's stomach dropped. The porch seemed to tilt beneath her. She barely heard the rest, just fragments about paperwork, fines, inspections. Her heart beat so loud it drowned out the conversation. This was how it started before, wasn't it? Growth, attention. And then someone somewhere tearing it down. By the time the man left with a polite nod and a warning to pause operations until further notice, Elise was already packing up boxes with trembling hands. We should have stayed quiet, she said, more to herself than anyone. Kept it small, kept it invisible. Jack tried to calm her, but the walls were already going up again, one brick at a time. Elise wasn't panicking about the rules. She was panicking because the past had taught her that good things don't last, and now she was sure this one wouldn't either. Elise expected the whole thing to crumble. That was how these stories ended, at least the ones she knew. One complaint, a clipboard, a few stern words from a city official, and everything unravels. It was easier to assume the worst. Safer. So when she stepped outside Monday morning and saw Jack in the driveway, coffee in one hand and a stack of papers in the other, she braced herself. Good news, he said, holding up a manila folder like a trophy. It's not as bad as it sounds. She blinked. The permits? Working on them. He nodded. Health inspections scheduled for Thursday. Temporary permits filed. Got the application in for a cottage kitchen license too. You just need a hand-washing sink, and we're good to go. Elise stared at him, stunned. How did you? Jack shrugged like it was nothing. Called the county office. Made a few stops. The clerk gave me a checklist and some advice. I brought muffins. That helped. A soft laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. You brought muffins to the permit office? Bribery is underrated, he said, grinning. Something tightened in her chest, not panic this time, but a warm ache. Gratitude, deep and hard to name. Because it wasn't just that Jack had helped, it was how, quietly, without asking, without pushing her to be stronger or less afraid. He saw her, unraveling, and stepped in with both feet on solid ground. He wasn't trying to rescue her, he was trying to stand beside her. Elise looked down at the paperwork, then up at him, sunlight catching the laugh lines by his eyes. You didn't have to do all this. I know, he said simply. But I wanted to. The breeze stirred between them, rustling the stack of papers like they were more than just forms, more like foundations. Jack handed her the folder, his fingers brushing hers. We're not giving up over one clipboard, he said. You built something here. You matter here. Elise swallowed hard, the words catching somewhere behind her ribs, and in that moment, she didn't just see Jack as the man who fixed engines and made Sophie laugh. She saw him as the man who could hold her world steady, maybe even forever. The flyer appeared on the fridge one morning, taped neatly in place beside Sophie's latest masterpiece, a stick figure drawing of the three of them standing behind a table of cupcakes, each one grinning ear to ear. Elise, Jack said, squinting at the bold letters on the flyer. Did you sign us up for the county fair bake-off? Elise blinked over her coffee. What? No. From the hallway came the unmistakable thud of small feet, followed by a very proud, very guilty voice. I might have. Sophie skidded into the kitchen, still in her mismatched pajamas, grinning like she'd just unlocked a secret level in her favorite game. I filled out the form online. It said we could enter as a team, so I put down your lemon lavender cupcakes. Elise set down her mug slowly. Sophie, the county fair? It's this Saturday, Sophie chirped. And you said the porch stand was just the beginning. This is the next level. Elise's stomach flipped. The county fair bake-off wasn't some quaint local picnic. It was a regional eventables full of serious bakers with years of experience, judged by professionals, sometimes even covered by local news. Sweetheart, she began, trying to keep her voice calm, I haven't done a competition in years." "But you're the best," Sophie said, matter of fact. "You always say baking is about sharing joy. And there's going to be a lot of people there who need joy, right?" Jack, who had stayed wisely quiet, finally gave Elise a half-smile over the rim of his mug. "She's not wrong." Elise looked between them, Sophie's eager face, Jack's quiet encouragement, the memory of the porch stand buzzing with neighbors and laughter. Her instinct was to shrink, to say no. But something stopped her this time. Maybe it was Sophie's faith. Or maybe Elise was tired of letting fear keep the oven cold. She sighed. "Okay, but if I burn everything, we're blaming the entry form." Sophie squealed and ran off to tell her stuffed animals the good news. Jack leaned over and whispered, "You know we're going to win, right?" Elise shook her head with a smile, but her heart fluttered. For the first time in a long time, she was willing to try. The fairground pulsed, with life bunting flapping in the breeze, laughter floating on the warm summer air, and the scent of kettle corn and grilled sausages weaving between booths like a memory. It was loud, chaotic, joyful, and Elise Hawthorne had never felt more out of placer, more alive. She walked beside Jack and Sophie, carrying their entry box like it was made of glass. Her apron was crisp, her hair pulled back neatly, but there was a glow beneath it all that hadn't been there weeks ago. Confidence, maybe, or something softer. Peace, people noticed. At first, it was just a few glances, then a nod, then a voice. "Elise?" Came a woman near the lemonade stand. "You're the one with the cupcake porch, right? I brought my granddaughter last week. She still talks about your scones." A man followed moments later. "Your cinnamon rolls are dangerous. My wife's got me driving across town every Saturday now." Elise flushed, stunned by the praise. Jack gave her a gentle nudge. "Told you." Sophie marched ahead like their biggest fan, waving at people and handing out tiny hand-drawn menus. "Try the lavender," she called proudly. "It's like sunshine in cake form." By the time they reached the bake-off tent, Elise wasn't just recognized. She was welcomed. Inside, long rows of tables stretched beneath the canopy, each crowded with cakes, pies, cookies, and gleaming smiles. Elise set down their tray carefully. 3 dozen perfectly frosted lemon-lavender cupcakes, each one topped with a crystallized flower petal and a dusting of powdered sugar. She glanced around, heart thudding. So many skilled bakers. So much history in every display. And yet, when the judges came by, it wasn't just the taste that earned her a second glance, it was the warmth in Sophie's voice when she described their Sunday baking traditions. It was the way Jack stood just behind them, hands in his pockets, beaming with quiet pride. As they waited for results, more people came up, some neighbors, some strangers, just to say thank you, for the cupcakes, for the porch stand, for being kind. And as the sun dipped low over the fairgrounds, Elise stood a little taller. Not as the recluse who once hid behind high fences, but as a woman finally seen for who she truly was. Not just a baker, not just a name, but someone who mattered. When the loudspeaker crackled to life over the fairgrounds' main stage, a hush settled across the tent. The crowd leaned in, judges clutching clipboards, contestants clutching breath. Elise stood between Jack and Sophie, her hands folded tightly, her apron smudged with flour and a trace of lavender. "Third place," the announcer called, "goes to the O'Brien brothers for their bourbon pecan pie." Applause rippled through the tent. "Second place." A pause. "The Cupcake Window Lavender Cupcakes by Elise Hawthorne and team." There was a beat of silence. Then Sophie screamed, "We won!" loud enough to make a nearby toddler drop a corn dog. Elise blinked, stunned. Jack gave her a look that said, "Told you," then pulled her into a hug before she could resist. She stiffened at first, but then, softly, slowly melted into it. The crowd clapped, some even cheering. One judge shook her hand with both of his, saying, "You may not have taken first, but you had the soul of the table." The first place winner, a retired baker, with 20 years in a commercial kitchen, accepted his blue ribbon graciously. But Elise didn't mind. Not even a little. Because as she stood there, Sophie bouncing beside her with a mini ribbon of her own, Best Assistant Baker, age 8 and under. And people kept coming up not just to compliment the frosting or the balance of flavor, but to thank her. A teenage girl said, "Your cupcakes helped me and my mom talk again." An older man offered, "We hadn't had anything sweet in our house since my wife passed. Yours were the first." Elise listened to every word, heart aching in the best way. No article, no scandal, no old ghosts, just joy. Connection. Home. Later, as they packed up their table and walked toward the car, Elise laughed at something Sophie said without looking over her shoulder, without lowering her voice. She didn't scan the crowd for cameras. She didn't shrink from attention. Her smile was wide, unapologetic, free. Jack glanced over and saw it, that lightness in her eyes, the ease in her posture, and something in him settled. They hadn't taken first, but they'd won everything that mattered. The letter was tucked inside a plain white envelope, left on Jack's kitchen table beneath a still warm plate of blueberry muffins. He found it too early for Sophie to be awake, too early for Elise to be gone without a word. But there it was, her neat handwriting on the front. Jack. Inside, the message was short, just an address, and a note. "Come by after work. Wear something you don't mind getting dusty." Jack read it twice, then 3 more times for good measure. And despite himself, he grinned. By late afternoon, the sun cast long streaks of gold across Maplewood's downtown strip. Most of the storefronts were familiar: an antique shop with a creaky door, the barber shop with a candy jar always full, the faded corner bookstore no one ever seemed to enter, but everyone claimed to love. And then Jack spotted it. Midway down the block, a small brick building with tall windows covered in brown paper and a red "Sold" sticker crookedly plastered across the glass. Elise was waiting outside, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back, keys dangling from one hand like a secret she couldn't keep any longer. Jack approached slowly, suspicion battling hope. "What is this?" She just smiled and pushed open the door. Inside was dust and promise. High ceilings, scuffed hardwood floors, a wide front counter that had clearly seen better days, but it was sturdy. The air smelled like time, like beginnings. "I bought it yesterday," Elise said softly. "It used to be a flower shop. I think it wants to be a bakery now." Jack turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "You did this without telling me?" "I wanted it to be a surprise." She hesitated. "But not just my dream anymore. Ours, if you want it." She pointed toward the back wall, where a long cardboard box leaned against a stack of paint cans. He opened it and pulled out the sign. The cupcake window, etched in warm wood and soft gold lettering, just like Sophie's drawing. Jack didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, eyes full of something deeper than thanks. Then he said, "Let's build it." The morning of the grand opening dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that felt made for new beginnings. A soft breeze carried the scent of rising dough and fresh paint as the last of the streamers were pinned, and the final tray of cupcakes slid onto the display counter. Elise stood behind the glass case, nervously straightening napkins that didn't need straightening, while Jack adjusted the crooked bell above the door for the 3rd time. Sophie was already in full uniform, a child-sized apron with official sprinkle boss stitched in rainbow thread and buzzing like she'd had 3 cupcakes for breakfast. She hadn't. Just excitement. Pure, sweet, electric. "Dad," she whispered, eyes wide as she peeked through the window. "There's a line, a real one, like, with people." Jack leaned over her shoulder, and sure enough, there they were. Neighbors, friends, even strangers. Some held reusable coffee cups, others had flowers or balloons, all of them waiting patiently beneath the new wooden sign that hung proudly above the door. The cupcake window. "I think I'm going to faint," Elise muttered, smoothing her apron for the 50th time. Jack grinned. "You baked 1,000 cupcakes in 1 week. You survived a fair. You got Sophie to eat something with lavender in it. You've got this." She looked at him, heart thudding beneath her calm. "What if no one likes it?" "They already love it," he said. "They're just waiting for you to let them in." At precisely 9 o'clock, Jack flipped the sign on the front door to open. The bell jingled, the door creaked, and the first customers stepped inside. From there, it was joyful chaos. Cupcakes flew off trays, coffee spilled twice. Sophie handed out samples, like confetti, proudly telling anyone who would listen that she was, basically, the boss. An elderly woman hugged Elise after one bite of the vanilla bean buttercream and whispered, "Tastes like my wedding day." By noon, the register was full, the tip jar overflowing with crumpled bills and handwritten thank you notes. Jack leaned on the counter beside Elise, stunned. "I can't believe this is real," he said. Sophie popped up between them, powdered sugar on her nose. "Can we live here now?" Elise laughed, the kind that came from the deepest part of her chest. Maybe, in a way, they already did. Sophie's 9th birthday came with more sprinkles than cents. The cupcake window had been decorated with streamers in every pastel color imaginable. Glitter confetti covered the counters, balloons bounced lazily near the ceiling vents, and a "Happy Birthday, Sophie" banner hung proudly across the main display case. Customers wandered in and out all day, many stopping just to offer birthday wishes, drop off little cards, or sneak Sophie another treat. She didn't mind the attention, she soaked in every second of it, twirling through the bakery in a new party dress, proudly wearing her upgraded apron. Sprinkle Boss, Level 2. Toward closing time, as the last rays of sun painted golden streaks across the floorboards, Elise disappeared into the back kitchen. Jack didn't think much of it, she'd been planning a surprise dessert all week. What he didn't expect was for her to return carrying a small, elegantly decorated cake topped with 9 pink candles, her hands shaking just slightly. The bakery dimmed as Sophie clapped her hands over the light switch. "Make a wish," she squealed. The candles flickered gently while Sophie scrunched her face in deep concentration. Then she blew them out in one giant puff, giggling as wax smoke curled into the air. "Okay," Elise said, smiling. "Time to cut the cake." Sophie took the first slice with the seriousness of royalty. She paused halfway through her second bite, fork hovering in midair. "There's something in here," she said, brows furrowed. Jack leaned in, concerned. "Is it a toothpick? A sprinkle clump?" But Sophie reached into the slice and pulled out a small velvet box, eyes wide. I don't think this is edible." Jack froze. Elise was already walking around the counter, nervous, hopeful, cheeks flushed pink. She reached for the box, opened it slowly, then looked up into Jack's stunned eyes. "You once told me good things never last unless you hold on to them. So I'm asking, can I keep holding on to you?" Jack blinked, speechless. Then, as the realization sank in, he laughed full, astonished, heart-deep laugh and dropped to one knee beside her. "Only if I get to hold on right back," he said, voice thick. Sophie gasped, hands to her cheeks. "Are we a real family now?" Jack looked at Elise, then at Sophie, then back at the ring between them. "We always were." Moving day was quiet, not the kind of chaotic scramble you'd expect, but a soft, steady rhythm of boxes shuffled across hardwood, laughter echoing between rooms, and the occasional clink of mugs being unwrapped from dish towels. It wasn't a far move, just a few houses apart, from Jack's modest bungalow to Elise's big brick home, but it felt monumental. The kind of shift you feel in your chest. Like a door, closing on something lonely, and a new one, opening on something whole. Sophie was in charge of labeling boxes. She took the job seriously, writing things like Dad's mystery tools, Elise's fancy teacups, and important cupcake stuff do not squish. When the last box was tucked away and the couch found its corner under the window Elise had once stood behind, Jack dropped onto it with a groan of mock exhaustion. Elise sat beside him, still barefoot from unpacking, hair tied up, cheeks flushed. She leaned her head on his shoulder without saying a word. Sophie bounded in from the hallway, waving a marker like a magic wand. "I set up the baking shelf in the pantry. Everything's in rainbow order. That's how professional bakeries do it." Jack grinned. "Is that so?" "It's in a book I read once. Or maybe I dreamed it. Either way, it's official now." Elise laughed, and the sound filled the space like warm light. Not the cautious kind she used to carry. Not guarded. Just happy. Dinner was eaten on the floor, picnic-style sandwiches and lemonade and leftover scones from the bakery. They ate off mismatched plates, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the soft glow of table lamps, not yet plugged in properly. It was imperfect and lovely, exactly the way beginnings should be. Later that night, as Sophie dozed off in her freshly decorated room walls, now painted the soft lavender she'd chosen, Jack and Elise stood in the kitchen. No more separate counters. No more windows between them. Just one table, one stove, one home. Elise reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I used to think I'd never have this again," she whispered. Jack kissed her forehead. "You didn't get it back," he said. "You built it." And, in the silence that followed, the house didn't echo anymore. It breathed. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen windows like honey, warm and golden, casting soft light across the flour-dusted counters and the rise of freshly baked dough. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon floated through the air, mingling with quiet laughter and the hum of a sleepy town waking up outside. Inside, the kitchen buzzed not with chaos, but with comfort. Elise stood by the oven, wearing Jack's old flannel shirt over her apron, humming to herself as she slid in a tray of raspberry almond muffins. Jack leaned against the doorway, coffee in hand, watching her like he still couldn't believe she was real, that this was real. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the display case, decorating a chalkboard sign in colorful loops and sparkly accents. She wrote the specials for the day: lemon love loaves, caramel churro cupcakes, and Sprinkletown surprise seach, one underlined with a little heart. When she was done, she bounced up to the front door and flipped the sign to open, just as the bell jingled softly above her head. Below the hours of operation, in Sophie's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words Elise had let her write. Weeks, AGA words they'd all agreed, belonged there forever. Love-baked, fresh daily. Outside, early customers began to trickle in. Neighbors waved from across the street. A little girl pressed her nose to the glass, eyes wide at the pastry display. Jack moved to the counter, tying his apron behind his back, already teasing Sophie about her new flavor names. The place buzzed not just with business, but with belonging. Elise turned to them both, smiling, not the smile she used to wear in old photographs, all polish and pose, but a real one, full, peaceful. Jack leaned in and kissed her cheek, whispering, "Another good day." And it was, not because of the muffins, not even because of the line forming at the door, but because the windows no longer held distance. They held light, they held laughter, they held home.